you ever noticed that some neighborhoods have clean air, parks, trees, and grocery stores, while others are surrounded by freeways, warehouses, and industrial buildings? Well, in ethnic studies, we use the concept of race in space developed by George Lipsitz to explain why this happens. This concept shows us that racial inequality is not just social or cultural, but it's also geographical. Racism becomes built directly into our physical environment. How, you might ask? Well, who gets access to housing, green space, transportation, clean air, and economic investment is not random. These outcomes were shaped by laws and policies over time which controlled who could move into certain neighborhoods and which communities received investment. Our author George Lipsitz explains that racial projects have always been spatial projects, meaning that race has always been used to organize space, deciding which groups have access to opportunity and which groups are exposed to harm. At the same time, marginalized communities responded creatively. Black communities turned everyday spaces like churches, beauty salons, and barbershops into places for organizing, protests, and political education. Tulsa Race Massacre is one of the clearest examples of how race, housing, land, and wealth are deeply connected to the United States, and it did not happen randomly. It happened because Greenwood represented Black economic success in a society built on white supremacy. In 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, also known as Black Wall Street, was one of the most economically successful Black communities in the United States. It was home to thousands of Black residents and included Black-owned houses, businesses, schools, banks, medical offices, and newspapers. Greenwood represented economic independence and generational wealth in a time when segregation and racial exclusion were the norm. The massacre was sparked by a false accusation against a Black teenager and was fueled by a long-standing racial resentment and the belief that Black prosperity was a threat to the social order of the time. This is Greenwood before the massacre, and this is Greenwood after. When it was burned to the ground, this was not just an act of violence against an individual. This was a deliberate act of destruction and disposition. Entire blocks of homes and businesses were completely destroyed. Families lost their land, their property, life savings, and every single opportunity to pass down generational wealth to future generations. And in just a matter of hours, white mobs supported by local authorities came in and destroyed everything. After the massacre, many survivors were forced into segregated neighborhoods. These neighborhoods had fewer resources and lower property values. And over time, these exact neighborhoods became the very places to later be targeted by federal housing policies. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the federal government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is also known as HOLC. The agency produced residential security maps that ranked neighborhoods based on their so-called financial risk. These maps used a color coding system. Green meant the best, blue meant still desirable, yellow meant declining, and red meant high risk. And this is where the term redlining comes in. Neighborhoods that were outlined in red were almost always racially mixed or Black neighborhoods. And these areas were automatically outlined as financially high risk. And this was not because of the quality of homes or the reliability of the residents, but because of the race of the people that lived there. And as a result, banks and loan institutions refused to give loans in these communities. This meant that even families with stable jobs and good credit were denied the opportunity to buy or invest in property. This is only because they were Black and they lived in Black neighborhoods. At the same time, white families that lived in blue or green areas were actively encouraged to take out loans and purchase homes. And they were able to purchase these homes with government-backed support systems such as the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Affairs loans. Over time, this created a massive racial wealth gap. Because Black families were blocked from home ownership, they were also blocked from building equity, passing down property, and creating generational wealth. Meanwhile, white families were able to accumulate wealth through the rising property values. And since homeownership is the primary way that wealth is passed down in the United States, redlining became one of the most powerful forms of institutional housing discrimination. Even after the Fair Housing Act made redlining illegal, the damage was already done. The neighborhoods that were redlined decades ago still have lower property values, underfunded schools, fewer grocery stores, and a weaker infrastructure. Because these neighborhoods were denied investment for so long, they were also denied political power. This meant that residents typically have less resources to challenge harmful zoning decisions, industrial placement, or lack of public services. These same conditions make neighborhoods far more vulnerable to environmental harm today, from pollution to poor air quality and even unsafe drinking water. And because healthcare is often less accessible in these areas, the health consequences can be even more severe. When we look at where pollution is concentrated today, we see a pretty clear pattern. Freeways, warehouses, refineries, and industrial zones are often located in low-income neighborhoods or in communities of color. One of the main reasons for this pattern is land value. Polluting industries are often placed where land is the cheapest, and cheap land is often the result of decades of redlining or housing disinvestment. At the same time, environmental regulations and protections in these neighborhoods are often weaker. They're delayed or poorly enforced, which allows harm to continue on for years without intervention. A real-life example of this is the town of Reserve, Louisiana. They're often called the Cancer Capital of America or Cancer Alley. It's a mostly black, low-income community surrounded by chemical plants and refineries. Residents there breathe in polluted air every day, and cancer rates are 7 times above the national average. This is Robert Taylor. He's a local environmental activist from Reserve, Louisiana, and he spent years fighting the chemical plants through community organizing and lawsuits. He has repeatedly warned that people in Reserve are being exposed to toxic air every day while companies continue to profit. His warnings point to a larger structural issue. These conditions exist not by chance but by long-standing zoning decisions, which are caused by redlining. What makes this especially important is that these facilities were not placed randomly. They were built where the land is cheap and where the communities had less political power. But pollution isn't the only environmental issue tied to housing discrimination. Another major consequence is the existence of food deserts. A food desert is an area where residents have limited access to affordable, nutritious food, especially fruits and vegetables. These are most common in low-income neighborhoods and historically redlined communities. For example, many parts of South LA have more liquor stores and fast food joints than grocery stores. And residents often have to travel long distances just to get a hold of fresh food. And this is another way that race and space show up in everyday life. Same neighborhoods that were denied mortgages and investment were also denied basic resources such as grocery stores, healthcare facilities, and green spaces. As a result, environmental inequality doesn't just affect the air that people breathe. It affects what they eat, their long-term health, and their life expectancy. And so when we examine food access, pollution, poor infrastructure, and health problems in low-income neighborhoods today, we are not just seeing environmental issues. We are seeing the long-term effects of racial housing policies. And so we saw that these systems did not disappear over time, but they actually evolved. Which is why a person's zip code determines whether or not they have access to clean air, fresh food, safe housing, education, and healthcare today.